Greetings, friends. Hey, Bear, what's up? Here we are back for another installment of From the Tomes. Yeah, we'll be on a bi weekly schedule from here on out. At least for the time being, while I finish off the game book and work on some other stuff. There's Peach. Yeah, back back for a little bit. As you see, Peach, I decided to wear the shirt after our discussion. I've had a flood of texts and that's, hey, there's Wolfie. What's going on? I haven't seen you recently. I was hoping everything was okay. I was actually going to shoot you a note because I haven't seen Russ on him quite a while. Yeah, so this was from the last time I saw them. It was incredibly underwhelming. And I don't want to jinx it because I hope it's great and I hope everybody loves it. But it was kind of like, wow, this is actually a little cringy, a little tough to sit through. When I saw him in 2000, though, it was probably one of the single best live gigs I've ever seen. Yeah, so I'm alternating weeks. Yeah, live, the energy that Andrew Eldritch puts out is the sum total of the show. And he can either be Jim Morrison good or Jim Morrison strung out bad. Either way. And when I saw them last time, they weren't that bad. They were just very, there was no energy. When I saw Bauhaus, it was the same thing. Peter Murphy was like dialing it in. You could tell he just wanted to get off stage. And it was, but he had played a show 2 nights before in another city, and everybody said it was fantastic. So, hey, everybody has off nights. Hopefully, if everyone that I know who's going to go see the gig sees the gig, enjoys it. Yeah, exactly. Right, right. I've only actually seen Ministry once, and they were pretty good. I mean, they weren't their heyday good, but they were good. So, yeah. So hopefully it'll be good and everybody will love it. Frankly, the only thing I'll probably run to is if she gets to a nearby gig will be Susie Sue, because I've never seen Susie Sue. I've never heard that she's put on a bad show, so I would still go see Susie Sue in a heartbeat. The sisters, like, we still might go to Philadelphia. Depends on money, depends on time, depends on how much we feel like dealing with it. Again, it's kind of like that weird, like, and Skinny Puppy's coming through too. Now, Skinny Puppy's fantastic. I would go see them anytime. I don't know if I will, but I'd go see them anytime. Figured I'd have a little banter before we get into the meat of the show. So, on an every on an every 2 week schedule at this point. I haven't been doing the daytime chats because I've been neck deep in the writing of the game and prep material. Yeah, no, really, kind of same, kind of same. Um, yeah, yeah. Basically, at this point in my life, they're the only two I'd probably go see. I'd go see. I at one point was deep, deep, deep into Fields of the Nephilim, and I ran the fan list in the United States, and I knew members of the band, the former band, the original band, the whole 9 yards. I've seen them once. They put on a great show. They just put on a show in London that was apparently wonderful. It's not the original band for the most part. I would go see them if it were convenient at this point. I mean, that whole genre, that whole kind of post punk, pseudo goth genre, I think was really fixed in time. Fields are almost like gothic Motorhead, like a cult Motorhead. Like, it's this very different experience when you see him live. And the good part about that is Carl McCoy will cancel a show if he thinks it's going to be a bad show. That upsets everybody. But they've never really put on a bad show, and that says something. That really, I mean, he'll go for years without doing anything, and until he's ready to do it. There are a lot of factors in that. Like I said, I got to know members of the band pretty personally at one point, and there's a lot going on with them folks. But but I don't have their personal phone numbers or addresses, unlike certain very stalkerish fans accused me of having. That was a rather bizarre experience. Oh, I think Bauhaus recorded is brilliant, and live they're usually brilliant. I just saw them on a very bad night. All right. Twitch TV from the Tomes, Fox and Board Games, at YouTube, foxandboardgames.com, Fox and Board Games at Patreon, which I guess I should put up your, should I Patreon? Patreon, I keep to correct myself. It's not a patron, it's a patron, which I will show off in a minute. And foxandboardgames.com is the website where you can find everything Fox and Board Games. And if you haven't already, like, subscribe, follow. I'm plugging the hell out of Patreon. We've had several new subscribers in 2 days. Largely thanks to Maeve, who has been promoting things relentlessly and wonderfully. And the uptick in our social media has been amazing, which is thrilling. It's exactly what we needed. So stop by all of this, and yeah, I'll be putting Patreon here next week. People have asked, are you going to be crowdfunding and kickstarting the game? Probably, but it has to get some kind of generated buildup first. Again, part of that's going to be going to TotalCon and maybe some other conventions over the summer to run the game. And let's see. So I guess I'll bring up some websites here to show off. So the game progress continues. Clock in at over 400 pages, and there will be things that still need to be added, and there are a lot of things that are going to be probably reduced and put into later books, because I simply won't be able to get it all done on any kind of time frame if I try to do everything. And I'm in conversation right now with another game designer who also would like to publish a book through us. And hopefully maybe by next week, 2 weeks from now, we'll have a little bit more news about that I can actually talk about. Until it's official, it's not official. I learned that from music gigs. Until you're ready to announce it, until everybody's ready to announce it, don't announce it. That's the word. There's the Golden Fleece, which we'll talk about that and several other iconic mythological magic items tonight. First, I will, of course, jump over to the work share. And let's pull that one right up. So, Fox and Board Games website, which is getting continuously updated. And here would be the Patreon at Fox and Board Games. So, again, we have had several new sign-ons. Here's my cue video. Several new sign-ons in the past 2 days, which is great. I have several patrons, including a member of your household there, Peach, from the previous $1 lifetime membership tier. You'll get a lot with that. There are some of the really high-end stuff you obviously won't get. And in typical salesman fashion, if you subscribe now, actually if you subscribe or upgrade the subscription before the 30th of April, you will get a wonderful piece of artwork from Joseph F. Arsenault, or Jeff as I've known him for decades now. Hard to believe, 2 decades. This piece of work right here will be signed. A print of it will be signed 8x10 from the artist. So that's for the first 50 people to sign up before April 30. And we are looking forward to that. And it's great because I've had some people sign up who are actually doing it explicitly to get some of Jeff's art. And I'm thrilled with that. I'm fine with that because we plan for the crowdfunding and for several other events. There's Justin. How's it going, man? And for several other events to have more of his art be part of this thing. And he's thrilled. I talked to him a little bit earlier. He's absolutely thrilled. People have been catching on to it, are interested in seeing his art. So it's going to keep growing. Things like this tend to have this tipping point, and I think we're getting to that tipping point of it becoming a thing. And not just my game, but as I said, I really am excited about some discussions I've had in the past 48 hours with another game designer about some substantial discussions with finished work who would like to start. Yeah, the mutt. I hear that. I used to let mine in and out, and then he wants to go in and out again because he's now old. He's now old and crazy dog. So every 2 minutes he's like, "Oh, I have to go out again." He was always kind of like that though, honestly. So that's where we're at. That's where the game design is at. Again, now my main focus is going to be prepping for the conventions. I picked up my to-do list earlier. I ticked off what I had to do to get my games in order. I will now go to my start playing games. Chirp chirp. I think it's GM. Yeah, here we go. Now they're my reviews. Got another good review today from a player last night. So I've been running a couple games online just to see how it goes. Ran Intro to D&D last night. A very short scenario that was my kickoff scenario for the 2+ year long campaign with a local group, all of whom I had the pleasure of seeing on Saturday. Hopefully I'll see more of them again soon. Blackmore Manor. Yes, the name is a direct reference to Blackmore. There is a distinct old school homage going on there. It's not set in Blackmore. It was set in Greyhawk. This is a generic world. 4 brand new players. I had 4 brand new players who've never seen a D&D before. It was kind of fun. They were amazed and thrilled at the game, and they were really interested. And maybe some of them will continue. Maybe they won't. They all seem to have a good time. Some of them, they're all varying grades, of course, of very quiet, kind of just roll dice and asked a couple questions to people who are kind of leading the party. So they had a lot of fun. It was really great, and yeah. So I'm gonna be running another session of that. I've got something else that has not gotten any signups yet. It's kind of I don't know. Do you want to call it a boutique D&D game? I don't know. Maybe. Think Game of Thrones crossed with Ravenloft. Think on that order. And it's going to be very role play intensive, and it's not a traditional D&D setting. And if I get people to sign up, I will run it. I've had it in my mind for a while. I have the groundwork of it laid out. I'm waiting to see how that goes. And I'll be running a scenario of Tales of the Hallowed Land, Blood Out of Bondage, which I've run quite a few times, both online and in person. And another session of Cold Plague. So we'll see how it goes. So far I've had players sign up and enjoy it, which is great. And this will all, of course, also build into my long-term plans of making this a little bit more than simply I'm going to write a book and try to sell copies of a book. The game development is becoming kind of this whole experience that I'm crafting. And I've already got some other folks on board who are interested in there you go. Who are interested in making this kind of a bigger, broader experience, and it should be kind of interesting as it goes forward. So it's been an exciting 36 to 72 hours on the game front. Hopefully that momentum will continue. It's needed in this kind of weird months of January, February, where you're in this kind of weird mental stasis and personal stasis. But yeah, let's talk about some stuff for tonight. So, yep, stop by the Patreon if you so choose. Check it out, see what I'm offering, see what goodies you can pick up. Keep an eye on all that. And we're moving on to this evening's topic. We're going to talk about magic items. So we talked about magic items in a very broad sense. 6 months ago, maybe? I don't know. I'd have to go look at the date. It was over the summer, I believe. So it was at least 6 months ago. At least 5 months ago. And, every one of these talks that we've had about game content and game development always boils down to There's Tara the Bar. Hey, how are you doing? Magic stuff. Yeah, I know you love magic stuff. There's Tara. Um, and it all boils down to every time we discuss one of these concepts, we'll be discussing culture, game cultures again in a couple weeks. By the way, we are on an every 2 week schedule, as I've said before. We have the next month, 2 months basically planned out as far as topics. Maeve has helped me organize my thoughts and all this tremendously, and kind of get things in an organized fashion. Tara and I just had a similar discussion regarding content organization. Um, and it's like a task unto itself, and it's great to sometimes have a second person who looks at you and says, let's organize things this way. And that's a great tool for the creative. So we have 2 months worth of talks more or less planned out bi-weekly. And yeah, so what I really wanted to talk about this time, we talked about magic items in a very general sense last time. What I really wanted to talk about is where we get this idea from of magic items. The mythological and literary sources. The literary sources, I would argue, are in fact identical to the mythological sources, or at least extrapolated from the sources, the same sources. Like, we're going to talk later about The Ring of the Nibelung and Fafnir's Gold, which were essentially the inspirations for respectively The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Yeah, Germanic folk tales that became incorporated into Tolkien's work and were the source of his basic plots. They really, I mean, okay, yeah, sure, the ring cycle is different from Lord of the Rings in terms of characters and cultures and all this sort of stuff, and it was all, handcrafted by Tolkien, but it was essentially the same story. Um, so yeah, we talked about that last time. We talked about this idea of magic items growing with you. And I mean, that's, we won't, let's not restart this conversation, but in looking at Pathfinder, one of the things I really like about it is they talk about crafting and leveling items in a very concrete way. And it's definitely something that is interesting. I remember, of course, now the Elric RPG, which we'll always touch on when we bring this up, being that Stormbringer, or alternately the Stormbringer RPG, as it was called for a while. Stormbringer is one of the quintessential modern fantasy artifacts. That is actually quite a bit less rooted in some of these mythological and literary sources that we're going to talk about tonight. And that's part of what made it unique. And the PFD, yeah, third ed, yeah, well, that's pretty much exactly, that's the thing. If you don't like third ed, now third ed, Pathfinder 2 is very different from third ed, but it is still an exercise to make a character. And that's why I talked on Saturday with my group about eventually restarting our D&D 5e game. And Pathfinder came up because two people are playing Pathfinder right now. And they were kind of like, I don't think anyone here is going to really like this. Now, having said all that, I think I have a fairly unique Pathfinder campaign. Well, it's not really unique. It's Freeport. But my ideas in it, I think, are a little unique, that I will probably be running at some point for friends, and I'll probably put it out online at some point. But it's going to be very non-dungeony, rather piratey. So in taking a look at this concept in the past couple days of these magic items, I kind of started breaking them down mentally into how we perceive magic items in the mythological sense, how we perceive magic items in the literary sense, versus how they're treated in most fantasy role-playing environments. With the exception of stuff like Call of Cthulhu and Elric, where the items themselves are given these really distinct, often malignant personalities that are attached to them. Everybody knows the worst thing you can get as a gift in Call of Cthulhu is a book or some strange object. Golf bag full of swords, trademark, exactly. So it's one of those things where in fantasy role-playing games, as I tend to say, that these things function instead of technology. Magic items become technological devices. They become shortcuts to the system. They become cheat codes for the system in some way, right? Your +2 sword allows you to hit things you couldn't normally hit, both in a numeric sense and possibly in a narrative sense. Oh, the werewolf can only be harmed by a magic weapon. All right, so you need your +1 or +2 sword or whatever, or +1 candelabra, a magic candelabra or whatever. You know, historically and mythologically, magic items had a very specific place in the cultures that created them, and they were inherently tied to their cultures. These mythological items. So the first thing I wanted to look at, and I have this extensive list, but I'm only going to go through a few. Don't worry. This could be a 4-hour talk. The Rod of Seven Parts. This could be this 4-hour talk, but it's not. But the couple things I wanted to look at, I tried to look at a variety of mythologies, because of course a vast majority of what we know comes from Greek and Scandinavian mythology. But let's talk about Kader Idris, the Chair of Idris, the giant from Celtic mythology. So the Chair of Idris was owned by this giant, and anyone who sat into it was transformed into a puppet. So it serves this very different role. The first step is kind of what I classify as functional magic items. They have some functional purpose, like a tool or an object in the world. Well, all right. And that's the other thing, and we're going to talk about that. That magic items aren't always a great benefit in the historic myth, in the history and the myths. There's a whole section at the end that I'll talk about as magic items as cautionary tales, and in many cases they function like that. And you even see that in the Chair of Idris, because if you did not have poetry in your soul, and you sat in the chair, it drove you mad. And this is a trope that we see carried up through. I thought this was amazing because the most immediate relationship I could draw was the Blood Tide, I think it was called Blood Tide season of American Horror Story, set in Cape Cod, which was also one of my influences for Cold Plague, the Call of Cthulhu game set in Cape Cod. Not the plot. The plot's entirely different, but the atmosphere of it, of Cape Cod in the winter as a horror setting. And in this world, what the vampires were in this setting, what the vampires were is they were given a pill, well, we don't know if the pill had some alien DNA or supernatural blood in it. We don't really know. We're never told. But a person who took this, who was an artist, would become a brilliant example of their artistic discipline: writer, painter, tattoo artist, if they were gifted. If not, they became essentially a revenant, a Nosferatu-like revenant that would stalk the landscape and become, and by the way, they'd also become a vampire even if they were artistically gifted, but they had control over their faculties. And they would become like the ultimate Toreador. It was like the ultimate Toreador pill for anyone who plays Vampire the Masquerade. And it was a really well presented. I mean, American Horror Story is highly hit and miss. It's highly extremely good or extremely bad. And in any one episode, it can get to both points. But this, I thought, all in all, the 8 or so episodes that dealt with this environment, that dealt with this vampire story centered around the arts. It was also, of course, this whole critique on of art culture being vampiric. I mean, that was kind of, the subtext. But it reminded me when I was reading about the Kader Idris, I was like, that's a lot. Like what we see in modern renditions of this thought that there's this very vague separation between genius and madness, and then take it a step further, that if you're trying to attain genius and you're incapable, there's this madness, this compulsion that comes along with it that destroys you. So again, even in this, there's this cautionary tale. The magic molds, which I never heard of, from the Yellow Emperor Review, in Chinese mythology. A yellow emperor. That's interesting for all of your mythos references. I don't ever know if the yellow emperor was also referenced in the yellow sign, but the yellow mold was this mold for making things in, but he could tell it to expand or shrink to create any sized object or device that he wanted to. And he also eventually used it excuse me, to stop a flood by expanding it to such great size that it would stop a flood. I thought that was pretty interesting. The cup of Jamshid from Persian mythology, and it was possessed by the ancient rulers of Persia. It was said to be filled with an elixir of immortality. Now, this is not such an uncommon magic item trope, right? Um, and I kind of then started thinking about this idea of functionality. These magic items as functional things, as functional devices, more so than we see them in a lot of RPGs. The icing death scimitar, exactly. Weapons, I think, become a different thing, but weapons do overlap with this. Like, let's look at Thor's hammer. Thor's hammer is always thought of as the weapon he smashes giants with, right? He was also a builder and a shipwright. And that is often overlooked in a lot of the retellings of the mythology, that his hammer was a shipwright's hammer. And in fact, the popularity of Thor's hammer in ancient Scandinavia, of course, had to do with the god and his physical power, and it was a phallic symbol and all these things. But it was also popular among workmen, among carpenters. I'm just keeping an eye on my real life fire behind me to make sure it's still going. So I thought that was pretty cool. But I actually became a little obsessed with reading about Thor's goats. Tangrisnir and Tangnozadir. Teeth thin, and he has gaps between his teeth, and teeth grinder. This brings up, and one that grinds his teeth. So this brings up a really interesting set of discussions. So the goats were so important. Absolutely. Absolutely. And this immortality goes through several different threads that we're going to look at in a minute. And I'm sure we can all already think of quite a few in which the immortality tale, or the vessel of immortality, because the cup that contains an elixir of immortality, of course, is a predecessor to Tales of the Holy Grail. Right? So there are the Arthurian myths just become this melting pot of, even more than the Norse myths, this melting pot of things that came before. And I find that really fascinating. But the goats. All right, so I'm calling them objects. They're not objects, they're animals. So this is what I'm exactly going to talk about. So not only were these goats pulling his chariot. Okay, so they were part of a mode of transportation, another magic item. Thor's chariot that he could fly across the skies and fight and battle with. But goats were so important to the Norse that they paid attention to things like they have a gap in their teeth, and they grind their teeth, and they named them accordingly. And it was so important that these goats were identified, that Thor's goats were identified. But Thor could eat his goats every night. And as long as he had the bones from those goats, they would come back the next day. So they were also extremely indicative of the psyche around goats that the Scandinavian people had, and how important they were as a source of food. To think that one of the greatest gods in the entire pantheon, sure, we've got his hammer, he flies through the air, but like the most powerful thing he has, in a way, are these goats that can keep him fed forever. And I'm sitting there kind of going, this says so much about the culture. And then the goat's bones effectively are these magic charms, fed and mobile. Right, and in the cultural context, this becomes this whole different thing. Now, we see echoes of this in quite a few magic items in Dungeons and Dragons, right? Everfull cups, decanters of everfull various liquids, everything from vinegar and mayonnaise to water and healing potions, right? So there's this echo. But again, these come out of this really specific cultural context. And part of the stress I've always had in any modern plentiful horns, exactly. I've always had in terms of the positioning of these magic items in modern fantasy settings is that they lose an identity. Figurines of Wondrous Power, Horns of Valhalla. I think there's a goat in the Figurines of Wondrous Power too, a ram, right? So there are the echoes of this. Now, of course, I would argue that the originators of the genre and the game, for as flawed as they may be in many ways, Three Goats, their match set. They were maybe a little bit closer to some of the literary sources initially, and therefore mythological sources, than modern renditions of the game, in which there's no cultural context as to why a magic item is a certain way. I mean, the magic swords in D&D were originally everything from Stormbringer, which was called Black Razor in White Plume Mountain, to Sting, a sword that glows when orcs are around and is a +1 to hit. That was one of the first magic items a character of mine got out of a module in D&D first edition. So clearly these immediate references were there. But the swords didn't have a name. The weapons didn't have a name. The items were not attached. Now, you could argue that in, say, something like Dungeons and Dragons, the magic items which would be equivalent to these are the artifacts. These things that have been, in fact, touched by some sort of power that, well, so I mean that's all part of the discussion too, right? This appropriation of all of these. But let's talk about appropriation for a minute. We're going to get to that in a minute, because the Norse were amazing appropriators. When you look at both Celtic and Scandinavian folklore, and particularly the items and some of the archetypes, they are clearly taken from the Fertile Crescent cultures. And it's this direct line of descent. And I think in every world where people get a hold of these mythologies, they convert them to their own cultural context. So maybe that's why now magic items are more like iPhones, right? Like I think magic items in modern versions of D&D and Pathfinder or whatever, they totally lose this wondrous context because they've replaced technology, right? Well, I have a microwave. I have a magic item, right? The pot of ever cooking, or whatever you want to call it. But I could also say that people 500 years ago would have said, "Oh, well, what's would be the most valuable magic item to you?" And they might say, "Oh, a pot that's always full of food, so I can feed my family." I mean, I think these are kind of universal things. So we've got these items, and I have this list of them, and there were a couple of the really cool ones. So obviously, there's a lot of swords and other weapons, everything from Excalibur to the Grail sword to Lancelot's swords, Arundita, and that is of course again a named weapon. Tridents, clothing, the feather cloaks, like Freya's swan feather cloak in Scandinavian mythology too, which is this thing that kind of goes through so many ancient cultures, because we find out that Central American people had feather cloaks. We find out that tribal steppes people had feather cloaks. We find out that, Proto-Celts in southern Germany had feather cloaks. It's like this thing that kind of was everywhere. But then there's another step, and there are some obviously really, really obvious examples of this. Magic items as an embodiment of otherworldly or divine power. There's a few key ones here. They're the big one that almost everybody can probably immediately mention is the Ark of the Covenant. Well, right. That's the Roman culture was famous for this too. I mean, they just appropriated everything. There was representation of God from everywhere they went that it folded up into the Roman world. But if you look at something like the Ark of the Covenant, right? That's kind of the ultimate, at least common consciousness version of an item, a magic item that is not simply an item, but it is a direct descendant of a supernatural power, a direct creation, an embodiment of supernatural power. So excuse me for one moment. I do have to throw another log on the fire. That's not a euphemism. Speaking of things that would be considered sacred items in ancient culture, things that start and sustain fire, right? That's also, I mean, that's a whole talk unto itself. Kind of like I went to one of Amy Blackthorne's talks, pagan focused talks and pagan mythology talks, and it was about plants and plant medicine and plant spirits. And like halfway through the talk, she started she just I was seeing it and other people in the room were seeing it. Yeah, Prometheus, right? And she sat there and she kind of got this pensive look on her face. And after the talk, I went up to her and I was like, so what's with all the people turning into trees? She's like, that's what I was thinking. I realized as I was talking that like all of the stories I was telling involved a person turning into a tree or a plant. I was like, there's something really interesting here. That's this whole talk unto itself. But anyway, so we have the Ark of the Covenant, right? I mean, that's like kind of the most obvious of, it's quite literally an embodiment of supernatural power. But another one that interested me is the mace called Sharar of Sumerian myth. And the initial stories of it predate even Sumerian records. And it is a mace that is wielded by Ninurta, and it's used to defeat demons, and it can fly across vast distances without impediment and come back to its wielder. What else does that sound like? That sounds like Thor's hammer, but it was directly tied to Sharar. It was an extension of Sharar. It was I'm sorry. Sharar was an extension of Ninurta, the god. And it's not only a weapon, but it's intelligent. And it guides him. And it's considered the emissary of this even higher being. Now again, all of this wraps up. And to hold it is considered to be equivalent to a god, to be on par with a god. And that's kind of the other thing that we find missing from a lot of common RPG environments is this idea that it's these items, and again, maybe the artifacts from the early editions of Dungeons and Dragons were this equivalent, but they were quite literally power-ups, like the ultimate power-up, right? They were the cheat code for the BFG in Doom, right? And it's like as soon as you typed in that cheat code, you were totally invincible. But these were directly tied to some sort of supernatural intelligence. It was something that was considered this embodiment of a deity. I guess you could say that certain character types in certain games, Paladin's Holy Sword, for instance, touches on that. Again, Paladins themselves and then champions, again, in Pathfinder, the champions are a little bit broader, but Paladins have that entire, Christian, romantic, medieval mythology of what knights were. And of course, we know real knights were nothing like that. They were generally pretty horrible people, just like most people who get power in any kind of society, right? They were generally not chivalrous or friendly or giving or caring. But Sharar was an intelligent thing, and it was thought that it was conveying an even higher intelligence to Nintura than he as a god had. And that's pretty interesting. So it seemed to be channeling this additional source. Enlil, actually, it was an emissary to Enlil. So it was a direct line to Enlil, which is fairly interesting. and it's something I hadn't really heard of. Now, again, of course, there is it goes down to Mjolnir. Vajra was another interesting one. Vajra from Hindu mythology, and it's a club with a ribbed spherical head, and yes, of course, it has all the phallic implications thereof, and it is repeatedly indestructible. And it's often used, representations of it are often used in modern Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, and it is considered something that is a direct link to something divine. Kind of interesting that we're seeing these trails. So this kind of leads into the third category that I've more somewhat mentally defined. Music how. Well, yeah, absolutely. So and most people here know I studied early music, and people assume I mean Renaissance or medieval, and yes, there is that. But music's far older than that, and it wasn't. And a lot of the instruments that we see, especially in academic early music, are sourced from much older cultures, and it's only the past 200 to 300 years that music and ritual have been separated, right? I mean, even let's say some of the Breton dances that I know that are probably from the 1600s, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later. They were all originally part of folk practices. I mean, they've become popular dances, even to the point they've become popular dances in cultures that are attuned to this kind of thing. Yeah, we were just talking about musical instruments. So, I mean, music instruments as magic items are highly well. It makes, I think, in our modern, I think since the rise of the classical culture, well, there are instances of it before. Well, right, exactly, right. The what happens when a person listens to music is biological, it is psychological, it is psychic. It deals with vibrations. If we want to get into this on a metaphysical level, I would argue that music is a tangible example of metaphysics. And that's another thing. Now, music instruments are extremely underrated in these games and underused. Now, you have bard classes, right? Almost every game has a bard class. But it's usually not the instrument itself that does anything except confer a bonus to something, to some act that the player does. Now, I found so many examples of magical musical instruments in mythology. Again, that's this whole other tangent, which I'm not even going to get deeper into, but I found some really cool stuff. All right, so I haven't actually paid a lot of attention to that. So I would take a look at that because that could be really interesting. I know they're expand. I know they're when I was making characters for the online D&D game, I noticed that the number of actual historical musical instruments they talk about now is expanded, which is good. It's like, wow, they actually have like real medieval instruments in a quasi medieval setting. Great, that's perfect. So, and I understand I'm one out of maybe a couple thousand people in the world that would sit there and nitpick whether a sham or a Rauschpfeif is medieval. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of talking about bards and how I think they've just kind of been diluted. I know they're powerful. I had a bard in the game last night. She really enjoyed playing the character. But I think they've been cheapened to, oh yeah, look, another spellcaster. Like, I think some of their innate abilities from earlier editions of the game were far more interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, they're crazy powerful, but I'm kind of like, I don't feel they have as much of a personal identity in terms of. I kind of feel the way about all the classes, but I'm not going to get into that. The third magic item category, right? Now it's another spellcaster, right? Oh, in addition to because every character in the game last night had spells. It was hilarious. I'm like, oh yeah, let's have some classes that are easy because they're not very magic intensive. Well, no, never mind. They're all magic intensive. which I guess is kind of cool because everything's a spell now. I mean, I guess I see this, but I don't. From a design perspective, I don't. To me, it's just kind of boring. But so be it. People love it. I'm good with it. Magic items is a symbol of divine right or rulership. Again, this well, yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, and then there was this whole talk at PAX about can we have some non-horny bars? That was literally the title of the talk. I didn't get into it; it was packed, but it was really humorous. The little bit that I heard of it, so it was this kind of inversion of bards as not necessarily the sex symbols of the game. I mean, a lot of that I would argue also has to do with certain popularizations of the game and genre, and people tend to follow popularizations and stereotypes. If they were really like real musicians, they would all look really cool on stage and not wanting to talk to anybody for days afterwards after they got off stage. And they don't go home and go to sleep. They eat a bag of Doritos and drink a beer and go home and go to sleep after the show, like most musicians I know. That's how generally how music life is. Everyone thinks there are all these wild parties going on, and most of the people sit around the green room for a half an hour and drink a beer and are like, "I'm beat." Especially when you reach a certain age. Magic items is a birthright. So the golden fleece. That was the whole theme of the golden fleece was that the fleece was in and of itself, yeah, all food exactly. My bard's really pretty. Well, the Minotaur thinks you look really hungry. The golden fleece was actually from a winged ram. So again, we have this ram appearing, a flying ram appearing, sacrificed to Zeus. Jason had to steal it to help procure his rulership, his role as a king. This is a very old story. It was old at the time of Homer, so that indicates how old it is. So we have this item that had to be given to King Aegeus. Well, the ram was given to King Aegeus, and the fleece was as a symbol of authority and kingship. It had to be stolen as a symbol of divine birthright, loosely. That's the paraphrase of a very long epic. So again, this item now becomes less about the properties that it has and more about the symbolism attached to it. And I understand that this is the kind of thing that is extremely hard to simulate in most traditional formatted RPGs, right? Like most most RPG characters aren't interested in settling down to become king and they're not going on a quest to find something. But this also goes back to Excalibur again, right? That the sword itself, yes, it's this powerful sword wielded by King Arthur, but it did what it really does is it denotes his place as the king. So this is another way that we've positioned magic items or items of power in these old stories that I think sometimes get a little lost. And I would say that this lack of identification with royalty is good these days, but at the same time, it's always interesting to me to think, and this is very common. I just picked up the Golden Fleece because it's been one of my favorite stories for a long time. But I thought it was kind of interesting that I guess I never really saw it or never really thought about it until I recently did some more reading on the source of the tale. That it is quite literally the symbol of kingship, and that's why it was stolen. And there's multiple tellings of this. Well, so there were rumors about Pagiani's violin that it was granted to him by demonic or divine forces, right? That he made a pact with the devil for his magic violin and his ability to play it. I mean, that's not that old of a story. Well, that's where I'm going with all this, right? That in most modern role playing games, magic items are commodities. They aren't objects of a quest in and of themselves, and when they are, they're usually a MacGuffin. They don't actually serve any narrative context. They don't mean anything in this story. And that's kind of where this whole talk is going. Like, I'm not sure why. Yeah, Eric Clapton, his deal with the devil. Robert Johnson, his deal with the devil, right? Musicians can't be great on their own. They have to have made a deal with the devil. But I think that's testament to how powerful that Deathlock, their deal with the devil. Yeah. Yeah, well that's just given, right? I think that's a testament to how powerful music is too, right? And what music, and we know that music is one of the first things to get banned when any fundamentalist takes over, right? We know that. Whether you're talking about the Quakers or fundamentalist Islam or some of these other cultures, dancing and music are the first things to get banned because they're not only powerful personal expressions, they're powerful cultural expressions. So, where this talk is all going. Venom. You'll have my Venom albums when you're prime for my cold dents. Yeah. Cold dents, poly sleeves. Magic items as an extension of cultural symbolism and cultural belief. And that's where this entire talk kind of boiled to me, was that in a way we've cheapened these things in the RPG context because they don't mean anything anymore. There's no greater cultural context to a magic sword, a +2 sword. Now, the campaign can dictate that, of course. And I have played in and run games, and people have always... I have one more thing. Capitalism is ruined. Yeah, magic items. Capitalism ruined magic. That's what's funny, right? Because a lot of the old RPGs and a lot of the old computer games, first person, and the earliest MMOs were basically these giant exercises in capitalism, right? Of amassing this imaginary wealth with no context of anything else than the reason was to, like, the selling of magic items, right? There was absolutely no, context for these items other than to amass imaginary power. And tarot card, deck of many things, absolutely, yep. Oh, absolutely. My first Ultima Online account I sold for, at that time, was a good amount of money. Because I had a Grandmaster character with several different skills at Grandmaster. I was like, someone's going to actually buy these pixels? What they bought was time, of course, right? I mean, that's how we understand it now. I remember when magic items and magic golds and gold started first going up for sale, and friends of mine who bought it, I just busted them mercilessly. I would send them texts like, "Hey, want to buy a pixel?" Things like that. And I just hammered them mercilessly because I'm like, it's not a thing. Now we get to NFTs where people are not only paying money for pixels, they're paying money for shitty pixels they don't even own, right? The pixelated hamburger they don't even own. They're actually paid some guy $200 for it. You're just like, oh man, at least if it were a one of a kind bad painting of a hamburger, I'd say cool. All right, you got yourself a one of a kind bad painting of a hamburger, whatever. And again, whatever he wants to spend money on, I don't care. But I'm just sitting there going, wow, yeah, exactly. This idea of using tokens instead of real money in both the game setting and non-game setting. And the number of festivals I've been to where you have to convert music festivals, cultural festivals where you have to convert money to tokens. I understand that's also for the ease of the mob of volunteers that they have who are not getting paid a dime, who are trying to keep this festival running. 5 tokens for a beer is a lot easier than a guy handing a $30 and for his 2 beers that are $18, and having to have some poor person make change. So yeah, like at the amusement park, and I get it. There's actual practical reason, But there is this conditioning that goes along with it. But magic is an extension of cultural belief. Lord Agni-Dev, the god of fire and the destroyer of all the bad elements in the universe. Agni, the spear, was only useful in that cultural context. Like Lord Indra invoking it against his enemies also is this powerful cultural symbol in India. And it is invoked in a cultural sense. It is invoked in a sense that, in a way, embodies India. I talked about the feather cloaks. In every culture that has feather cloaks, whether you're talking about the Swedish or you're talking about Mesoamericans, they don't only have necessarily religious or spiritual or magical significance, they have a really deep rooted power, cultural power, that they mean something culturally. Native American totems, and not the abstract sense, the literal physical totem, right? They are a symbol of a culture. And to a Native American, they are magical or they're spiritual. So that's a whole other discussion. At what point did the spirituality become divorced from this idea of magic and power? And that can go in so many different directions. We don't even have time for that tonight. Han Feitzi's shield, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Chinese. It's a Chinese parable. A man who was trying to sell a spear and a shield. And when asked how good the spear was, he claimed it could pierce it. The spear could pierce any shield. Then when he asked how good the shield was, he said, "It is so powerful it will defend against all spear attacks." Then he asked, what would happen if this spear strikes this shield? And he said, I can't answer that. So that tells a lot about trade customs and trade mores of the time. I found that to be an interesting example how it's almost this cautionary tale about dealing in a marketplace too, right? It's a very kind of unique way to phrase it by having these two items of power. So we have these items without the cultural context. And that's going to lead me to kind of where this whole thing started. I mean, I kind of came up with this idea a couple days ago. So well, of course, yeah. Short answer: modernity. Absolutely, absolutely. Because we've become divorced. We've become divorced from the idea of the sacred in the context of an item not only being sacred. Well, I can't say that actually. Let's take a look at Catholicism. At many masses, there are two magic items that are present to the believers: the body and blood of Christ. They are, in effect, relics of these practices because, in the heart, in the mind of the true believer, even if they don't literally think they're drinking the blood and eating the body of Christ, which is a whole other worm, a whole other can of worms, and a whole other rabbit hole about Catholicism and its sources that, of course, greatly interest me, that I'm not going to get into tonight. But to the believer, they are experiencing the divine. They are interacting with magic items at that moment. Weeping statues. Not only in Catholicism, but in India in particular. There are many cases of weeping statues. Well, right. Spirituality and mysticism takes a lot of work. Most people don't want to do that work. Even a lot of modern magicians and practitioners don't want to do that work, And that was one of my issues with the extended pagan community, that it was still people just reciting a chant in a circle and not actually thinking about it at all. But I think that's just people. I think if we go back historically, for as many people who went to the Temple of Athena, maybe 10 out of the 1,000 actually thought about the Temple of Athena, right? And the ramifications, the greater ramifications of the Temple of Athena. So my whole kind of summary of this goes back to last night's game. I don't anticipate anybody playing this, so I don't think anyone's going to feel that this is spoiled. Justin might remember this, though I don't think he was there at this very first session. All right, the rituals are essentially community, yeah, right. And if I know from firsthand experience, even in these supposedly greatly open-minded communities, if you're the person that starts to dissent and starts to say, I don't think it should be done that way because it's, for whatever reason, you are the one that then ends up walking out the door under your own power because you've been uninvited. So I can testify that firsthand, and I think at least one or two other people who are in the chat tonight. I don't know how many are in the chat tonight, could also relate to exactly what I'm talking about. But the cornerstone, right? Absolutely. The cornerstone of this kind of became cemented in my mind last night. Divorced from, I'd already planned this talk. I'd already started taking notes. When they found the scenario corner piece, which was a Rod of the Pact Keeper, being used by a goblin warlock, being sought by a goblin warlock. They found it when he could not. And to the new players, this iron rod engraven with the images of these twisted anthropomorphic human and rat bodies and with an iron rat skull on top became this object, this mythical object in the course of their first time playing D&D, right? They all had built up, like, but when we were talking about it towards the end of the game, they had built up this whole backstory about it and how it came to this house and what the elf in the beginning was trying to tell them and how it related to this. And some of them were correct, how it related to this object. They realized that they were holding something that was completely unique because they were not yet jaded. And they weren't going, oh, it's just a +1 Rod of the Pact Keeper. Any warlock that picks it up will adapt to them and they can use it as a weapon and cast more powerful spells. Like, they hadn't started thinking yet in the context of it being a tool to cheat the system, of a shortcut. They really viewed it as, in the game world that I had introduced them to, even this little sliver of it, this 3-hour sliver of it, that it was this really special thing tied to these powerful forces. And that to me was really, really interesting. That to me was it kind of gelled everything I was trying to come up with about this talk. Because again, how many +1 swords have your characters sold at the market to get 2 potions of healing or whatever, right? And in fact, it's funny because at one point they were so amazed that they all had a potion of healing. It was like this really big deal to them. Meanwhile, like, in our regular Thursday night long-term campaign, Blake hands one out like, oh yeah, by the way, you actually have 2 more potions of healing. There are these things that it's like, if you know the characters are going to need them, then you just somehow magically find, some wandering halfling in the wood who sells them to you. But to them, it became this thing that was really interesting. This object that was really interesting in the environment. It was as interesting as finding Indra's spear. It was as interesting as finding, one of Zeus's lightning bolts, javelin of lightning, or something like that. And it was really cool to me. It was really cool to me. And it again reminds me that in all of our games, most of the games I've played in, most of the games I've run, magic items become this thing that become extremely commoditized. And I think, as everyone has said, that's a reflection of modernity. It's a reflection of how we view objects. So think about it. Thor's hammer. 1100 years ago in Scandinavia, owning a hammer was a pretty big deal at all. Having the money to have a good hammer made of wood with a metal and having a trade to use it with, that was almost magical in and of itself. So I don't think it's any surprise that a lot of tales center around these objects that are at the time, even if we think of it household now, because let's face it, we can get a hammer at Home Depot for $2.99 for a cheap hammer, right? I mean, really, you can maybe a little more, but you can get a cheap hammer for less than an hour's worth of work. Whereas it might have been weeks of work to make a hammer, at least a week work to make a hammer intact. That was a solid hammer. I've had the privilege of knowing people who do modern blacksmithing, modern fletching, modern bow making. They still consider their objects magic items. These items that they make out of raw materials by hand, it is an alchemical process to them still. Brewers, right? Let's go to Justin. Let's go to Justin in the brewing. That this whole discussion that brewing was a magical act. Brewing was a magical act from Sumeria up through the Middle Ages. Well, right. And if you play video games, now it's interesting, right? They were kind of murder hobo last night. They pretty much wanted to attack everything, man. They didn't even think to search anybody or anything till I just casually mentioned it. And I thought that was this really interesting dynamic. Like they were obsessed with this bottle of brandy that had been gotten out of this ancient cellar that was in this mansion they had to go investigate, that the elf showed them. This like captivated their imagination. The copper off the goblins, they could care less. Well, right. And yeah, yeah, boy, I could go down a personal rabbit hole on that one with a person who I was in communication with, contact with, collaboration with for a while on something. And he was a blacksmith. He wasn't bad. Wasn't the quality of some of them that I've known, like Lars, from New York Renaissance Festival, and yeah, Rennie version of Tonewood, yeah. Lars from the Renaissance Festival, who I don't believe forges anymore, but he was really a master worker. Like his items were these divine magic items. Yeah, Lundgaard, or yeah, and his stuff. I should add him in my new account too, because he's also a pretty prolific photographer now. I don't think he's still crafting at all, but he is just like his stuff. You look at and you think, yeah, that's magical, right? And the fact that he has forged it all with his sweat, and his power, it makes it even more magical. So I think there's such a disconnect between that. And we need new plates. Order them off Amazon. Oh, look, they're here at the door the next day. They're made out of recycled materials that never break, and I, can throw them in the washing machine, which I do, right? Like I'm a modern human. I've never, for as much as I like to romanticize these ancient cultures, I don't think I'd ever want to live in one. I'd be long dead by now, I'm sure. Um, you know, I I definitely think that it is all these things that we've talked about: the commoditization, the modernity, the cheapening of items themselves. I'm not gonna again. I'm not gonna go down this rabbit hole because it can open up all kinds of other cans of worms. But let's look at even at firearms. Um, Firearms. It lent itself to Walmart. Well, going to critical was, yeah. So that's yeah. There's a lot of discussion about critical role in the treatment of magic items. And that's definitely played into it. That's definitely played into it. But let's talk about firearms even very briefly. Even though I don't think anybody here is uncomfortable with the discussion of firearms. I know some people are, as a general topic. But I have one of the original 357 Smith and Wesson Magnums off the line. not the limited each handcrafted, but it has quite a few handcrafted components. It was from a family member that I inherited. It was almost unattainable at the time. It was extremely expensive. It was considered prized to own one. And now, depending where you live in the US, you can walk out of a gun store with a polymer gun in 20 minutes. That was made in a factory in Indonesia, right? I mean, let's just look at that in terms of how we think of weapons, right? A weapon used to be something that was a prize that you had to earn, and you had to be really good with it. And I'm not even talking about guns. I'm talking about before that. Oh, absolutely, right. Or third print one, or 3D print one, right? Which is a whole other discussion, which I'm not even going to get into. So yeah, and that even to me is, and I think to most people I know who are deep enthusiasts, and I'm not a deep enthusiast. I like historic weapons, but even most modern gun enthusiasts, I know the idea of everybody being able to print one in their home is like, yeah, no, let's not do that. But anyway, so ending it on a note um of gaming related, yeah. So that's also been part of it. Is the modern presentation of magic items has also been heavily influenced by video gaming, right? I mean, not only Mercer and Monty Hall type campaigns or magic items as utility, and everybody gets dozens and dozens of dungeons and magic items. Dungeons and magic items is right. Dozens of magic items. It's this idea. Ah, that's nice. Cool. Yeah, I have a couple of the antique guns from Italy actually. That came one of them came over from Italy. So antique shotguns. And I think that video games have also greatly influenced the way people treat magic items as simple augmentation. And again, I'm not even saying this is bad. I mean, if that's how you really like to play the games, that's great. I would say they're the biggest factor. I would say loot drops. I mean, Adam, who's off and on here, Corporate Ninja, talks about one of his players at one time literally like just blowing up this whole pen of captive enemies because he thought they would have loot. Like literally, this was in a D&D game. Like literally, his thinking was a whole pen of captive enemies. If I fireball them or whatever he did to them, they're all gonna drop loot. And it was kind of this. It was kind of this like, wow, like what, like that. But again, that's because it's a person who only played video games. Yeah, they'd only play, yeah, wow, and wow. Right, exactly. They had only played video games. So their only reference to all this was video games. They had no understanding of this actually being being in a context of a world. And it's really an amusing story. I was like, when he first wrote it, I'm like, you're kidding me. I was like, no. He's like, this guy just blew up this whole group of enemy captives. And they were enemies, okay, they were whatever, orcs or whatever. But his whole rationale was that they were going to have it wasn't like we have to exterminate the enemy, So they're going to have loot. So with that, friends, I think we're going to start to wrap it up tonight. Well, at least tied to the plot. Like, right, exactly, right. If it's tied to the plot, I don't mind if someone goes and does something totally crazy. That's fine. But this wasn't even a plot rationale. There was no narrative thinking here. The guy, and it was a new player. It was a brand new player. It wasn't anybody who had experience or, and it is funny because, I started my game last night thinking, what if anyone's going to do anything like, oh, I do this in video games. I kill the shopkeeper and I start looting their shop, I mean, you can do it in some video games, so why couldn't you? But right, if it's a narrative decision, there's so many of them. At least one of them has to have a grain item. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they have to have magic items. Yeah, when they finally did decide to search the goblins last night, I was like, yeah, no, they've got nothing. They've got nothing. They're goblins living in an abandoned house. They've got nothing, I assure you. Well, folks, thanks for tuning in. We're going to do some wrap up. It was a good chat. I appreciate everybody's input. Thanks for everybody for coming on. And again, got a lot more news coming down the pike. Hopefully it's something that we can share in a week or two time. But from the Tomes, Twitch TV from the Tomes. If you're not already following at Fox and Board Games on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Patreon, go over and check it out. See what we've got to offer. We've got some game content coming down the pike for subscribers. Some's already there. Some is already there. There's already some stuff like maps I've made and encounters, and creatures and encounters that I've created that are there. Yeah, squeezing the Cheshire Purple Worm. They have to have something in there. Yeah, I tried to kill off a whole party once by luring them into the purple worms. Often have treasure in their gut. They didn't fall for it. They ran the other way. They were like, "Yeah, no, we're not going to risk that." The thing the size of a subway that just barreled through the underground and did damage to us by its sheer seismic pressure. I don't think we're going to try to attack it. So stop on over to foxandboardgames.com. Check the displacement. Yeah, displacement alone. It was through displacement alone. Check out everything I have to offer. And thanks for subscribing, following, and supporting. You're going to hear a dog growling and cat meowing at any moment. Thanks a lot, everybody. It was a good chat. And we'll see you again in 2 weeks. We'll put the topic up shortly. And we'll see you later.